Welcome to the WTR Small Cap Spotlight Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's special podcast episode, I'm being joined by my colleague, Dmitry Silversteyn, WTR Chemicals and Materials Equity Research Analyst, to discuss the recent developments in the seabed mining industry, given the Trump administration's recent announcements that impact the sector of critical metals mining and steps already being taken by companies in the industry. Good morning, Dmitry, and thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Tim. Thank you very much for having me on.
Dmitry, to kick things off, for those listeners not familiar with the topic, please formally define deep sea mining or seabed mining, and perhaps provide a quick overview of the history and the current state of the industry at the moment.
Sure. Thank you, Tim. The term is widely used, deep sea mining or DSM. Some people call it seabed mining. What it comes down to is looking and finding and exploiting mineral resources at the bottom of the ocean rather than on land. Just by way of talking about this, similar to many other resources like oil and gas, with the Earth being 3/4 covered by water, it stands to reason that there is as much, if not more, resources located in the bottom of the ocean as there are on terrestrial deposits. So deep sea mining is not a completely new industry. It was first polymetallic nodules and other resources have been discovered going back into the 1800s, I should say. And a lot of work has been done in 1970s and 1980s by mainly US, but also European companies to develop commercial recovery regulations and to develop some of the technology. If you look at the deposits, they typically fall into one of 3-4 categories. We have things like phosphates and cobalt crust, which are typically found near shore or on continental shelves. You have other minerals, again, that are found on continental shelves that do require what I would say more of a traditional mining or dredging type of exploitation. And then we have polymetallic nodules, which are found, again, also in shallow waters, but more so and more abundantly in deep sea. And we're talking about 4,000 to 6,000 meters under the sea, typically lying in abyssal plains or other parts of the ocean in international waters. Geographically, we talked about territorial waters, which every country has. It usually extends out to the continental shelf. You got exclusive economic zones that take out another 200 miles into the sea from the border of a particular country. And then you have international waters. Exploitation there has fallen under the United States Convention Law of the Seas, and what that organization set up, a regulatory body called International Seabed Authority to develop the regulations for commercially exploiting deposits found in international waters. The idea there being that it's a common heritage, that no one country owns the minerals or the rights to the minerals in these international waters. And UN was trying to come up with a mechanism to make sure that developing countries who do not have substantial land-based mining industries or other sources of economic development, such as the island nations in the Pacific, that can benefit from this new resource development and can actually have some financial benefit from that will help them grow their economies. The industry really gained prominence as a potential source of critical metals over the last decade, coinciding with electric vehicle demand, which is expected to increase demand for critical minerals significantly in excess of what every analyst and the consultant has projected terrestrial mines capable of supplying. So it's become a much more of a timely and even urgent discussion right now, because if we are going to follow the path of electrification as a primary driver of economic growth for the global economy going forward, we need these metals, and there is just no scenario under which terrestrial mines can meet the expected demand. We've also seen a lot of environmental studies being done over the decades to try to understand what deep sea mining can do to the environment under the ocean, both with respect to disrupting the marine life, as well as emissions and things like that we've learned from terrestrial mining can be a problem for humanity longer term. So as information on that front comes in, it's giving people a little bit more of a confidence that these resources can in fact be mined in an environmentally responsible manner.
Great. Next, let's pivot to what seems to be the most top of mind topic currently, polymetallic nodules. What are they? Where are they found? And does the technology exist today to cost effectively mine them?
Thanks. So yeah, as I said, the polymetallic nodules were originally discovered in 1800s. So it's been around for quite a while. They've been found pretty much everywhere we've looked, both on continental plates as well as in deep sea and abyssal plains that I referenced. They are created as a result of precipitation of metals and minerals over millions of years. We're talking about, these are golf ball sized to maybe potato sized nodules. They grow by about 1 millimeter to 10 millimeters per million years. So very slow growth precipitation process. And as the name implies, polymetallic, they contain multiple metals. The exact mix varies by location, but typically they contain iron, nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese in much higher grades than are available in current terrestrial mines, particularly the new ones coming on stream over the next decade, which by definition, because we have been mining the earth for 2,000 years, tend to be of lower grade than existing mines. The technology, as I mentioned, was developed in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s, much of it adopted from offshore oil and gas industries and has been improved and optimized over the years. Because of the higher concentration of metals in these nodules, you're basically looking at lower capex costs versus conventional mines. There's no need to develop extensive energy, transportation, water, and other infrastructure. Again, think about where these mines are located on land. They're usually in very remote regions that require roads to be built, that require electricity, infrastructure to be set up, water infrastructure to be set up. None of that is necessary with deep sea mining. You collect the nodules where they are, you transport them by ship to any port that's able to take a seagoing vessel. You can offload them there and get them to a refining or a processing site pretty much anywhere in the world. Also, because these are highly concentrated metals in these nodules, you don't have the cost that is typically associated with high waste that's found in ores on terrestrial mines. So there's no worry about tailings, what to do with them. How do you control the toxic leaching from these tailings? A lot of the processes that are being developed have near zero solid waste. So basically, all of the nodule can be processed and converted into a sellable product. And that makes economics very compelling. From the reports that we've seen for some of the companies that have gone some ways down in defining their resource and defining their operating parameters, we're looking at something that's going to be at the lower end, probably the lower quartile when it comes to operating costs compared to terrestrial mines.
Great. If environmental concerns are the main objection to the development of deep sea mining, how can the industry address these, in your opinion, Dmitry, and move the regulatory ball forward?
Well, let's talk about this. This is a really good question, Tim. We've spent many years, or the industry has spent many years collecting environmental data. So the white spot of the great unknown, if you will, of what will happen if we start mining these resources is really shrinking. One of the companies that's chiefly responsible for that, the metals company, which trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker TMC, has played a critical role in this. They've collected over a course of 23 sea campaigns over the past 14 years, nearly a petabyte of data. And just to give you an idea of what a petabyte is, the US Library of Congress, which I believe is the largest library in the world, contains about 20 petabytes of data. So this is a significant amount of information that has been gathered, that has been published publicly and released by TMC to the scientific community for independent analysis and verification. So data analysis is ongoing, but it includes, so far, pretty encouraging information. Some of the main concerns about the environment was the plume that would rise from the sediment as these nodules are being collected. There were speculations that this plume would rise tens of kilometers into the water and disperse over hundreds of square kilometers, impacting life throughout that distance. In reality, in experimental trials, and TMC has conducted a large-scale pilot trial 2 years ago, where they've collected about 3,000 tons of these nodules. What they saw is a plume that rises only 1 or 2 meters and pretty much settles down within tens of meters of the tracked vehicle that is going along the bottom. There's also been concern about what's called a midwater plume, which is when you pump these nodules to the surface, to the ship, that ship needs to release that water, and that water can have detrimental impact as it's being released into the ocean. That can be controlled and mitigated to a large extent by the depth at which you're releasing it. So again, the non-government entities, the NGOs, have been talking about significant damage or significant threat to the environment from this phenomenon. It does not seem to be happening. There's also been no measurable impact detected as far as macro marine life is concerned. Tuna migration patterns, noise pollution when it comes to whales. None of that seems to be an issue, particularly in the abyssal plains. Again, we're talking about 5 kilometers down. So we're talking about 3.5 miles down below the sea level, where hardly anything lives. I think it's something like 0.1 of 1% of biodiversity is located at these depths. So very, compared to the jungles or the rainforest of Indonesia, for example, where a lot of nickel mining is taking place currently, obviously this is not as biodiverse area. So there's fewer organisms to be impacted to begin with. And the microscopic organism recovery has been substantial. Having visited the same site a year later, TMC found 50% or better recovery in microorganisms that live in the sediment and live on these nodules. There's research by other companies and other entities that has been done over longer term that actually shows that once that sediment is stirred and some of the nutrients are released back into the water, that the microorganisms actually thrive better than they did before the passage of a tracked vehicle on top of that. So now all we need is for the International Seabed Authority, which, as I said, has been set up to develop regulations for mining deep waters and international waters, to focus less on NGO, let's say, vociferousness, and more on science, and finish the environmental regulations and put them into practice.
Thanks. That's really helpful color for investors looking at this sector. So moving on quickly, the White House in recent weeks has issued executive orders aimed at supporting critical materials mining and processing industries. Let's focus on the most recent one. How does it relate to the international legal framework, and how can it empower domestic entities to discover and develop seabed resources, Dmitry?
Sure. So the latest order came out on April 24th, so just a week ago, and it was specific to offshore mining and exploration. The executive orders reiterates U.S. right to mine the seabed minerals, including in international waters. The regulations that the U.S. has developed for mining seabed, and both in its territorial waters and in international waters, actually predates ISA. As a reminder, the U.S. has not been or has never been a signatory to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and they are not a member. They're just an observer of ISA, so they're not bound legally by international law framework. This order makes that explicit. It makes provisions for building a stockpile of nodules or other forms of offtake agreements. So what that means is that it basically puts, it provides sort of instant demand for these nodules that are being collected, or when they start being collected at commercial levels. The U.S. government is standing ready to support that financially by either building strategic stockpiles of these nodules to be used later once the U.S. has set up processing facilities, or perhaps friendshoring as opposed to onshoring. In other words, using these nodules to refine to have them refined and provide the materials in geographies other than U.S., but in geographies that are friendly to the U.S., like Japan, for example. And then it provides for a partnership between private companies and the government to map the seafloor, to discover and develop new resources, and to ensure that the environmental regulations are followed, and to make sure that this exploitation is done in an environmentally responsible manner.
Great. In wrapping up, Dmitry, you just mentioned Deep Sea Miner, the metals company. Last month, they made waves, pardon my ocean pun, by the way, by announcing their intention to submit their application for exploration and commercial extraction of nodules in international waters through a U.S. agency. Why did they decide to take those steps, and what does it mean for the industry?
Well, I think the primary reason they decided to take that step is ISA's failure to deliver a mining code, which they are legally obligated to do. This organization was set up for the express purpose of developing and publishing a mining code that companies can use, both private and government agencies can use, to safely mine the seabed in international waters. They've been working on it earnestly since 2011. They're supposed to deliver it, the mining code, in 2020. Obviously, we've had COVID hit, so that's been postponed to 2024. They failed again. Now they're talking about the end of 2025, but there's no guarantee, given a lot of the opposition from NGOs and some of the entrenched terrestrial mining countries like Brazil, like Chile, like France. There's no guarantee that they will be able to deliver this in 2025. And frankly, no private company can indefinitely wait for regulators to do their job while they're bleeding cash. So I think one of the reasons was the failure of the international agency to deliver on its mandate. The second reason is the current administration in the White House and their laser-like focus on standing up domestic critical metals industries so they're not dependent on China, so that they can decouple from Chinese-controlled supply chain of critical metals, and have the political will to see that getting done. And it's interesting that you mentioned TMC, because just this morning, the company actually announced that they have submitted 3 applications to the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, which is the regulatory agency under this regime. And this, again, goes back to the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resource Act, which was passed all the way back in 1980. And the NOAA delivered regulations governing this in 1989, which predates the creation of ISA. So it is really the first agency to come up with seabed regulations, mining regulations, and those regulations were at the basis of ISA regulations that they're now working on. As I said, TMC has now applied for 3 licenses, 2 exploration licenses in the territories that roughly correspond to the licenses they hold under ISA in the Clarion-Clipperton zone of the Pacific Ocean, as well as 1 exploitation license, which is a commercial recovery license. That the company has done this about 2 months ahead of schedule. They were looking to do this by the end of June, but they got this done here at the end of April. And it just goes to show you that this is an administration that private companies are very willing to work with, and vice versa, and administration that is committed to standing up a domestic critical metals industry. Now, these nodules will be collected in international waters, and initially, at least, TMC will ship them to Japan for processing, but there's always a possibility, especially as this ramps up to a full commercial production over the next 3-4 years, that there will be opportunities to bring these nodules to the U.S. and actually have them refined in the U.S. and create a self-sufficient American supply of these critical metals like nickel, like copper, like cobalt, like manganese.
This has been a really timely update, Dmitry. Thank you for joining us today, and a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Joe Brunetto. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Small Cap Spotlight podcast.